with the digital space. There is a quote that I have from the book. It's actually the ending paragraph of the introduction, and it says, moving forward, no digital and or wellness conversation can ever be complete without a conversation on digital wellness. The essence of this book is, on one part, technology is the best traction for us, and on the other part, it can become a great distraction. The journey between how we navigate the tech space is dependent on our understanding of the implication of the tech space to begin with. And so for me, having that backdrop of us being a merge between the offline and online world is one of the reasons why I put down this book. And the goal for me is, one, if you read the book, there's one theme that stands out, and it's the concept of identity. Because one of the things that I have come to realize is that the only consistent template within how we navigate both the online and offline world is who we are, is ourselves. A lot of times we advocate for governments to set up better policies, to put up better regulations, and a lot of countries are beginning to do that, and that is absolutely awesome to see come to life. We're also advocating for ethical tech creators. We're advocating for responsible tech creators, and that is also lovely to see. But the challenge with those two perspectives is that they are outside of our control. People operate more often than not based on their biases, based on their interest, and so you can't depend on an external factor to build the template for how your life will be. And so one thing that is 100% within our control is who we are, and the strength of who we are determines how we navigate the technological space. A classical example, for instance, is how a lot of research is showing that it's not necessarily the amount of time that we're spending online that is the issue in one context, but how we are spending that time. To a group of teenagers, for instance, it could be for social comparison, for instance, and that has negative consequences on their mental health and well-being. For another group of teenagers, it could be a platform to build their education, to build support structures, to do their business. They form healthy habits off of that. And you notice that for them, they have good mental health and their well-being is protected within the space. And so the anchor for me and the theme, like I said earlier on, you would see within the book, is the concept of us being grounded first before navigating any of the technological space. One of the questions I ask as a school of thought for people when they get the book is, do you think you have to be on all platforms to begin with? For instance, certain people believe that as long as the platform comes out and their friends are on it, they also have to be on it. And so it is extremely important that we get our identity on lockdown, because what that does is that it helps guide and forms the template which we now navigate the digital space. So for me, I'm super excited that we're here today, and we'll hear from our speakers, and during the Q&A, we'll share a bit more perspectives about the book. But I'm super excited to be here today, bringing out the book to the world, and I'm super grateful for the team of awesome people that are here to do justice to the conversation on digital wellness. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Theodora. Thank you, every other person that has taken out time to join this conversation. I celebrate you all.
Yeah, thank you. This is such an important conversation. Like you said, like first we need to be grounded before we can interact with these technologies, but these technologies are sort of net positive in our lives. And it's about learning how to be digitally well with them. And so to speak on that, we now have Nina Herscher, who is going to do our keynote address and tell us a little bit more about digital wellness and this book.
Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be here today and see some familiar faces. So I'm going to share just a few slides that I think speak to the essence of the work and what brings us here today. And then I want to talk more about Alu and kind of my journey getting to know him and how I feel about this book and all of the excitement that surrounds us. So can everybody see this slide? Oh, there we go. All right. So I am really just thrilled to be here because I think that so many of us are looking for that opportunity to pause and to explore our relationship with technology. And when I first heard about this book, I was thrilled because it really encompassed all of the things that we've been teaching, we've been learning, we've been culminating together and put it into this book. And so I'm wondering, for those who are here today, if everyone sometimes tries to take a break and sometimes they feel like this, they feel overwhelmed, they feel like it's hard to know what tech life balance means, they feel like it's hard to know how to manage their notifications. And I think this is a very common feeling, that we want to bring humor, we want to bring laughter, we want to bring transparency to this and really normalize it, because the best way out is through. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't name it, right, it can be so hard to know what the solutions are to all of these different presenting problems that sometimes feel like overwhelm. And so for those of us who are just joining us today, who haven't yet had the pleasure of opening this book that was just released, when we're talking about digital wellness, we're really talking about what is that optimum state of health and well-being that each individual using technology is capable of achieving. And we know that this has so many different domains. And so we can think about digital wellness and digital well-being as in the human communities, the digital communities, like this virtual room that we're in today, and so much more. And it's really that sweet spot. And so while taking that totally unplugged break might be amazing, and while we might crave a 3-day digital detox, we also know that in our world, that's not always something that we can do all of the time. And so digital flourishing is really that mindful approach. And I know that we just heard this quote. It's such a great quote. And so I won't read this again to you, but I will just say that I think that digital wellness is no longer something that is a luxury. It's something that we all really need to examine, and this book really speaks to that. And so digital flourishing is talked about quite a lot in the book. It was part of the curriculum that Olu went through and learned about as he became a certified digital wellness educator. And it's really that mindful approach, right, where we can engage in technology use that supports thriving in all different areas of life, and we can enjoy the beautiful things it affords us, like all of us being here today, like having this international community of learners and educators, but we can also be avoiding some of those associated harms. And the book does a really, really wonderful job of talking through how we can avoid some of those associated harms. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a moment, but what I wanted to share more words about is really about Olu and how we met and his journey in the creation of this book. Because we're seeing folks pop up all over the world who are change agents and educational leaders in digital wellness. And I just want to commend Olu for really being that, especially in Africa, but all over the world. And so let me pull up my other notes here. There we are. And so I think coming out of COVID, coming out of all of these different times where we've had to rely on tech more than ever before, has been a really interesting moment for us to decide how we want to be in the world, how we want to show up, showing up from a place of presence, really looking at how our mental health and our digital habits can intersect with each other. And as this revolution in tech has changed, has evolved, I think our terminology, our practices, and all of that have to evolve with us in this fast-paced world. And so while some people may have been drawn to this because they themselves are experiencing distraction, or maybe their kids are experiencing an addiction to video gaming, right? Everyone is going to have a different entry point. And I think that's really important to name, that no matter what brings people to want to read the book, they're ready for a place of change. So if that's prevention, we want to focus on kind of being the best version of ourselves, or if that's in a place of triage where we feel like we urgently need to assess our digital habits, there's no wrong answer. There's no wrong reason why people might be coming to read the book digitally well. And so for Olu, in speaking with him, I think that his moment where he really came to this was after he launched his mental health foundation in Africa, and how he saw firsthand how technology misuse and overuse were having these effects on the psychological well-being of the youth around him that weren't all positive. But at the same time, right, he could see how all of these things with technology, all the apps, all the tools, all the habits could be shifted and could be harnessed for the good. And so as I was reading Digitally Well and asked to write the foreword, I was really thinking about how this content is so helpful as we apply kind of a practical knowledge and a practical tool set. And I think that that's what makes Olu such a wonderful educator, teacher, and now author. And so it's been my absolute pleasure to track along him and track along his journey as this educator in the space, because I think this book encapsulates precisely what the world needs, which is really guidance on mental health, physical health, all of those different domains that intersect with our digital habits. And knowing him for years and his passion for this work, it has just been wonderful to see this book come to life as that concrete tool, because this combination of his insight and his passion for the work, I think, has resulted in not only him presenting internationally, online and in person, but also creating something that in its own form didn't exist yet. And with the Digital Wellness Institute, where I first, had the chance to work with Olu deeply and see him engage with peers and colleagues and begin to teach more and more, I see that all of the curriculum that we've created goes on to become these different kind of parcels, these different bits of knowledge translation, as our good friend and colleague here, Anna, would say, to help people in their time of need, and in this case, in their time of urgent need. And so I'm really confident that all who read it, all who purchase it today, I know Tracy's going to put the link in the chat again, are really going to breeze right through this book and just soak it up, because there are so many gold nuggets and so many pieces that have been translated so that you can begin your work, you can begin your new kind of practice, if that's individually or with your community or your team today. And so thank you all for having me. Thank you, Olu, for normalizing a lot of the common challenges and really focusing on the path forward, because I think that it is this path forward that's really going to help us to reclaim our peace of mind and focus on the solutions that will unite us across cultures, generations, and industries.
Beautiful. Thank you, Nina. I think there is such a need for this, like you said, and it is across industries, it is across age groups. Everyone can benefit from exploring how to be digitally well. We are going to move on to making sure you have a second to follow that link. And so as we do that, I'm going to remind you that this chat is, the chat has a link that you can follow on Amazon. And if you're listening to this later or you're on YouTube and you don't have access to that chat, you can also type in Digitally Well on Amazon and find the ebook or find the physical copy and order it there. So we're going to move towards our panelists and moderators, and I invite you, as you're listening, if you had any questions from what Nina spoke about, what Tosin spoke about, to start formulating those for the Q&A as we move into our other speakers and hear from them about how to be digitally well and their areas of expertise in this area. So for this panel discussion, we're going to have both Chris and Tio turn on their mics so they can be present with this. And I'll be helping moderate this and asking you guys some questions, as will Olu. So hi guys. Great. Do you want to introduce yourself, Chris? We'll start with you, and then Tio, do you want to introduce yourself and how you came to this work and how you know Tosin?
Sure. I'll start. Hello, everyone, from kind of sunny but quite dark Dublin. Just a quick thing to mention up front for those of you who've seen me before, I'm going to be speaking a little bit differently today. I have long COVID and it's really impacting my ability to kind of speak normally, but I've saved all my resources just for this because I wouldn't miss it for the world. So my name's Chris. I'm one of the co-founders of the behavior change consultancy Unplug. My background, interestingly, is reflected by one of the people on this call who I hadn't seen in a couple of years. So I used to work in tech consulting, and one of the people I worked with is Ian Bell on this call. And within that time, I was an early adopter, loved technology, and I still do. I worked in machine learning, data analytics and the such like. And during that time, because I was an early adopter, I kind of was one of the first people in my office to be always on, thought I was a bit of a legend. Over time, that had a bit of a negative impact on my productivity and my well-being. So I actually stepped away from that sector, moved across to the not-for-profit sector, and for 4 years worked primarily in overseas aid and development. One of my projects was working in India. And during that time, I was 2 years off the grid. So I'd kind of gone from being always on to always off. Because back then, 2012, India had no electricity, no data, no Wi-Fi. It's very different now. But it was this really interesting social experience for me, a very acute experience of all about data, all about tech, to having nothing. And I noticed real impacts on my behavior around my ability to focus, my ability to communicate with others, and my ability to just be well generally. So then when I came back to Ireland, I started working with a team that now includes people with backgrounds in psychology and neuroscience. And we started building programs around that. As a lot of people have talked about so far, that whole idea of not running away from tech, but just really changing the way we work with tech and manage our tech. And as part of that, we've been teaching alongside some of the other people on this call. Been very lucky to be part of the Digital Wellness Institute, and Tosin was one of the first graduates. So I'm delighted to be part of this because he was one of the most interactive people in one of those first courses a couple of years ago. So delighted to be here and lovely to meet you guys. Looking forward to this chat.
Thanks, Chris. Well, hi, everyone. I noticed at one point that I think we have about 4 continents represented here on this call, which is always just really exciting to see. And it's always wonderful for our digital wellness community to just have this opportunity to come together and to discuss these really important conversations, as Tracy mentioned earlier, and hopefully contribute something additional to this big conversation around how we can better relate to technology and really how to be digitally well in 2023. It seems to be getting sort of increasingly difficult and challenging to do. But my name is Tidora Pavkovic. My background's in psychology, in parent coaching. I'm also a certified digital wellness educator, so also part of the Institute as well. And I've been a part of this sort of digital wellness story since around 2016. It wasn't really known as digital wellness at that point. Even to this day, sometimes I find it challenging to explain to people exactly what I do when I mention digital well-being, but it was certainly difficult to explain it back then because I wasn't yet even sure of what it was that I was interested in. But for me, most of the questions really centered around the parent-child relationship and the interactions between parent and children, how they're going to interact with this increasing presence of technology. And I was living in Southeast Asia at the time, where technology is incredibly, highly valued. Children are encouraged to utilize technology, to really learn how to use it from very, very early on. And so I was starting to notice that increased connection with technology, and some of the questions that sort of naturally emerged for me were, is that going to result in a decreased connection between the parent and the child, which of course we know is crucial for any child's development. And so that was really my sort of entry into this whole realm. In 2016, it just so happened that was the year that I moved to the US as well, and started very eagerly to reach out and try to find other people who were asking some of the similar questions, if not in the context of the parent-child relationship, in the context of our relationship to work, our relationship to our romantic partners, our relationship to ourselves. And through that, I really got to meet pretty much everybody who's on this call, and connect with all of you and just be inspired by what you do. And I feel that I've become a lot better at what I do because I've had this opportunity to connect with all of you and to learn from you. So also incredibly excited to be a part of this, incredibly proud of Olu as one of the members of our community who just keeps giving so much to the community and to the world. And this book is a really great example of that. So really, really happy to be here.
Beautiful. And on this panel, I will be speaking as myself, Tracy McDowell, from the perspective of a digital feng shui consultant. I also came to this work around the same time in 2017. I feel like I tell this story all the time, but it feels like there was this big schism between people looking at digital wellness as a no phones at all, everyone has to be off of it, like at no point can you interact with phones, to okay, technology has goods and bads, how can we balance it and bring it into our lives? And that's what brought me to the Digital Wellness Institute and these like-minded people who have been circulating in this space. And so for me, on this panel, I feel like I'm really going to be focusing on balance, because feng shui, which translates in Chinese to wind water, is really this practice of looking at the natural balance of the world and then how we can bring that into our space, the spaces we inhabit, and then taking that even into the digital realm. How can we look at the balance that exists within the world and the way that the physical world is able to balance itself, and let's do that in our spaces. So I am really excited and honored to be a part of this conversation and speak a bit more about the things that I love about this book. So Alu's going to lead the questions and we'll just hop right in.
Awesome. The full house we have here. I want to jump straight into it. And the first question is generally to everybody. Upon reading Digitally Well, what is one thing that stood out for you? So just briefly, one thing that stood out for you and why upon reading Digitally Well. I'll start with Chris.
Tosin, you've been cheeky. I don't want to just give one thing. That's not fair. So I guess there were lots of things, right? But I'll come to the one thing that did really stand out to me as far as being different from a lot of the other books in this sector. The workbook. It's something that, we often read the most amazing content and then put it aside and we move on. It's a little bit like going to a keynote as opposed to a workshop. And I just love that, because it also comes down to the concept of, I know Carl DeMarchi at Harvard talks about this a lot, the idea of pixels versus paper. Until we actually write something down, it's a totally different formation when it comes to how we're actually connecting all the dots. So I love that idea of having a workbook, of actually identifying, going through your own identification and learning about yourself, but then also building on an understanding of your habits and those around you through that workbook. It's fantastic. So yeah, well done. That's what stood out to me.
Yeah, I think for me, one thing that stood out was I didn't want a situation where there was new information for people to develop on, and then there wasn't a platform or a template with which could guide them, help set up that platform. So I'm super excited about the workbook also. And there's also a bonus resource in the book. It's called the No Gadget Hangout. It's essentially a template that helps you build non-tech activities with your family or co-workers or friends, essentially. Let's go to Theodora.
Sure. So I was just going to say, today is actually national or global at this point, Unplugging Day. So we're not doing a great job of it right now. That's just because we have important things to talk about. But speaking of no gadgets, it's a really fantastic sort of global event that I would also encourage people to check out. And I feel like this book can contribute a lot to that conversation around what are some of the ways in which we can intentionally unplug. As Tracy said, we sometimes see these really extreme, severe sort of polar opposites of either being hyper-connected or being completely disconnected. And we want to be somewhere in the middle, as Nina mentioned earlier during her keynote as well. I think the one overall thing for me that stood out, as really soon after I read, I think just the title of the book and just the brief description, was just how ambitious the book was. So Olu is not somebody who's going to shy away from taking on some of the most fundamental questions, not just around digital wellness, but really about just existence. And a lot of what you talk about in the book it's some of the most fundamental stuff that we ask for ourselves, which is who are we? And that question has a sort of a different weight now that we're using technology so much. So I think for me, what stood out was the ambition in this book. I think you set up a really high expectation from the very start of what people can expect to read inside the book, and I think you fulfill all of those sort of demands that you placed on yourself. So that was something that really stood out to me, and what I really liked as well was that there was this combination of sort of philosophical, and practical and informational and educational. It's not a very long book, but there's just so much. There's just a great covering sort of all bases and looking at this question from a lot of different angles. I think sometimes we lean a bit too heavily into just focusing on the practicalities. So do this and don't do that, and this is when you should do it, and in this type of context. And that's a really important part of this conversation as well. Again, speaking of the workbook, we have to be able to take these concepts in, understand them, and then actually apply them. But what I really loved was that the book went even deeper than that, and went in really deep into talking about really crucial things like identity, like trust, like our ability to pay attention, and our ability to know ourselves. So those were kind of the key things for me.
Awesome. Thank you for mentioning that. I think while you were speaking, there was a quote that came to mind that is in the book, and that was what I used to conclude the book because it was just so powerful. It's a quote by Henry David that says, "The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it." And the question that was in my mind is, how much of life are we exchanging as we navigate the digital space? I think it's a very fundamental question that we need to reevaluate as we engage in these discussions today and as we leave this meeting today. How much of life are we exchanging as we interact both digitally and physically? I think that is super important to note. But yeah, I enjoyed putting quotes that were fitting to the different perspectives that were the book talked about. I also have a couple of quotes that are of myself also. Tracy, over to you.
Yeah, so as I said, balance is really important to me in my practice. So much of what I do is focusing on balancing so you can achieve transformation. And so what stood out to me is that our relationship with technology, that's one relationship, but having the activities that you can do with other people, like just things IRL or away from keyboard, AFK, that stood out to me, that you were like, okay, the relationships with other people, that is going to help and support our capacity to have a balanced digitally well lifestyle. That just the practices of looking at these digital devices, that's not the only fix. The really important key part is having the community that is also doing it with you, and that you were able to foster those relationships or encourage people to foster those relationships so they're not doing it in a vacuum, and instead are able to start working on balance within the relationships in their lives.
Awesome. Tracy, I would like to stay with you for the next question. I know you do a lot of balance, and you did mention in your introduction, most times when we talk about digital wellness, the first perspective that people have is, okay, we're saying no more technology, we're saying digital detox, absolutely. So the question is, does digital wellness mean no tech at all? Is technology morally neutral?
I think that technology is morally neutral personally. I know that in like the ethical tech discussion, like in this space, that's a really controversial opinion. But as someone who is differently abled and struggles with a disability, I have been on the front lines of seeing how technology has radically changed my life for the better. An example I like to often share is that people don't know that I'm severely dyslexic until I can't use some sort of spell check or Grammarly type system to autocorrect what I am writing. If I was born even 10 years prior, I think that people would not have understood my capacity because there wasn't the technology to help me catch up and stay on top of things. Another example that I often like to share that I think is really impactful is that now with the introduction of AI, my business and the things that I do move so much more smoothly and quickly because I'm able to input things into an AI operator that can then bump out stuff that used to really take and suck a lot of energy away from my capacity to work. And now it's like I say, hey, I need a list of the top 5 best blogs about digital feng shui for the next like 6 months. What does that look like? Whereas I would have spent a lot of energy prior to that AI capability really struggling with like, is this right? Should I do it? And so I'm a big fan of seeing technology as morally neutral and then being an advocate for like, how can we use it ethically? So knowing as humans, like what we can do with it and then letting the tech be a tool. And I feel like that's a phrase I say over and over again is technology is a tool. And so I think it is a tool that has gotten out of hand personally, looking at the clients I work with and the tech addiction that is really prevalent. But it doesn't change that it's a tool. So yes, right now it's a hammer that's kind of like beating some people in the head, but I hope that your book and the work that Chris and Tio and Nina and I do is teaching people to take that hammer away from their head, pull it out and be like, this is the tool. We are in charge of that tool.
Awesome. A question just came to mind when I was typing it in the chat box. I think I'll just read it out and then probably still type it. But the question is this, off of what you just said now, are you in control of your tech usage or is your tech usage in control of you? If you can just respond in the chat box, are you in control of your tech usage or is your tech usage in control of you? And if you don't know the answer, you can also say that you are not clear. A classical example, for instance, is who is in control of your notification? Do you pick your phone at specific times or upon every beep you are picking your phone? So if you understand the question, are you in control of your tech usage or is your tech usage in control of you? I'll come back to the chat box to see responses. I would like to go over to Theodora, and I would like us to hit base with the theme of today's conversation, essentially the theme of the book, but also the theme of the summit. And the question I have for you is, how do you define what digital well-being is, especially in this dispensation?
Yeah, so as Tracy was talking and as I was thinking about sort of what's my reaction to that question, I realized that I think all of us, when we think about defining digital wellness and what being digitally well means, we always make that assumption that tech usage is happening. You are using technology. It's just a question of really how you're using it. And there's so many other factors there, like what you just mentioned, Olu, which is this issue of control. So how much control do you have of your tech use? So the way that I've sort of defined it, not in a very, I didn't sit down one day and come up with a definition. I think through all of the work that I've done over the past 7 or however many years and all of the work that we've all done together, I've sort of come to define it as being digitally well, meaning that it's about using technology mindfully and intentionally and humanely, which is really important, in such a way that it doesn't tarnish your psychological or emotional well-being, or the psychological and emotional well-being of other people. And I think that's where that word balance that Tracy mentioned earlier, for me is really important, and where I try to communicate that across to other people, because I think in trying to help other people and helping ourselves, really, we tend to be very sort of self-focused. So we think about, how can I make this better for myself? Which is an important question to ask, obviously. How can I change my habits and how can I sort of, how can I relate to the technology differently? But everything that we do online affects other people. You know, every like, every little heart that we leave, every comment that we make, every video that we share, you know, everything that we do, every video we watch, rewatch, or just scroll past, whatever it is, it's engagement online, and our behavior is not only sort of picked up and absorbed by the algorithms themselves, but it also affects other people. And so, because I also often talk to families, to parents, to schools as well, I also talk about that aspect of, I think we typically tend to think of that in the context of sort of digital citizenship. So it's really about how you communicate and how you speak online. We know that there's I would say a pretty poor quality of dialogue online. And what we tend to see as we work with young people is that they've sort of absorbed that and it's become normalized. And in all of the research, when young people are asked, why didn't you report this particular sort of incident of online bullying, they go, well, that's just how people speak online. So I didn't think anything of it. I just thought that was normal. That's just how we communicate. And I think that's tragic. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest problems moving forward if we don't intervene sort of at that early stage when children are still young. So for me, when we're talking about what being digitally well actually means, it does definitely assume that we are using technology in some form or another. But it's really a question of how do we use it in the context of our own well-being, and then also how do we use it in a way that it impacts another person's experience in a positive way, and so that we make it a positive place for others to spend time in as well, not just ourselves.
Yeah, I think I especially love that your conclusion, because a lot of times when we think about mental health, when we think about digital wellness, when we think about navigating life, essentially, the bulk of what we do is focus on our own wellness as an individual, as a person, outside of how it affects other people. And so I usually tell people that in perspective, whatever you're doing, you have to ensure that it is not just healthy to you, but it's also healthy to the people around you. Because a lot of times people, so there's a quote that I wrote, and if I'm to paraphrase it, it essentially says that you shouldn't laugh at people, you should laugh at yourself. The reason is this: if you're laughing at yourself, you understand why you're laughing at yourself, and so you're within the control of that dynamics. If you laugh at other people, they are outside of your control, and so they don't have the full understanding of the motivation behind it. And so if it's somebody that is not fully grounded in who they are, for instance, probably somebody posted a picture of themselves and then people are making fun of it, for instance, they find their identity in that, and then they get into negative emotions, into negative energy. Somebody shared a quote that I 100% agree with, and it's also in the book. He said, it's not what people say about you that hurts you, it's what you believe about what they say. And so I think it's super important that above getting grounded in who we are, it's also very important that as we navigate with people, which is essentially what the digital space is an amplifier of like our physical and in-person life. As we navigate with people, that we are conscious of how our actions and inactions affect them. Very spot on. Thank you very much for responding to that. I'd like to head over to Chris now. Adding up to what Theodora said, I would like to ask, what do you think, in your opinion, are some of the most difficult aspects of living digitally well? We have a perspective of what it means to live digitally well now. What, in your perspective, do you think are some of the difficulties in living digitally well in today's world, and is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah, I think, just building on what both you and Theodora were talking about there in relation to the fact that we live in a systemic world and our technology is connected and systemic, as are our behaviors. I think it's the challenge of social conformity. So if we look at an area that Theodora would know a lot more than I would in relation to parents and families, I know when I talk to parents, especially friends, it's the whole thing for, the school are using the tech and everyone else has got the tech in the house. So we just assume that it's fine and no one questions that. And in some, in the context, it can be an absolutely wonderful tool, but it is that tool. And it's just been very much normalized with parents. And then in my world, more kind of from an organizational point of view, I think the world that we now live in, kind of this hybrid world of always on, it's a really interesting one, because we all know that 15, 20 years ago, the only people that were always on were emergency response units and, doctors and surgeons, etc. Whereas now we're all always on, the majority of us, and we just assume that's fine. And I think a big part of that is we've never had the discussion around a lot of the things that, you talk about in your book and the likes of the Digital Wellness Institute have within the course around actually sharing work design and communication charters, where you're sitting down and saying, okay, we have all of these tools that we're using. This one tool, so whether it's WhatsApp or Slack, this one tool is the priority if there's something of high priority that pops up at the weekend. Whereas at the moment, most organizations, from a social conformity point of view, people are checking everything, so all of the apps all the time, just in case. And there's no one who is really benefiting from that, So I think for me, social conformity is the biggest challenge in that context.
Tracy and Theodora, I was wondering if you will want to add any thoughts to that. We have just one more question aside this to generally take. Theodora, you can go first.
Yeah. Sure. That I was just kind of reflecting on what Chris had said there. I think for me, the first thing that came to mind, and I think that a lot, sort of the way technology looks and feels in the physical space, which I think is reflected in terms of how the virtual spaces that sit inside all of these devices are actually designed. But there's a very intentional quality there of kind of seamlessness, right? Of a lack of friction, which anytime you listen to designers talking about how a particular website is designed, or any type of digital tool, if you talk, or not talk to, but if you listen to Steve Jobs talking about the thoughts that he had and the ideas he had and the inspiration he had to design the iPhone and all of the Apple products, you get a sense of just how important almost like a digital smoothness, if you will. I always think of the word smooth as being the key. And I think if you have an Apple device and you kind of observe it a little bit more closely, you'll notice that there's a kind of smooth seamlessness to it. It fits into your hand or your pocket very, very easily and very naturally. And if you look at a lot of the virtual spaces where we spend a lot of our time, they're also designed to be very, very frictionless. You just move through them very, very smoothly, which of course can be great in certain sort of conditions and in certain instances, depending on why you're using these. So Tracy brought on some great examples of just how useful and helpful a lot of this technology can be when we really, really need it to be productive or creative, or whatever the case is. The sort of flip side of that is that we don't have these natural stop signs in the virtual space. It's very hard for us to see where we've entered that space and where we'll exit. There's no natural sort of front door, if you will, to come in and out, and we sort of get lost in that space. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, especially not with the conversations around the metaverse and how that's going to be built out. So for me, that to me, on a personal level as well, is one of the things that I find to be the most difficult. Is there is that seamlessness of how all of this tech is integrated. Just looking at sort of the where I'm sitting right now, I have about, I think, four screen-based devices here, and that's not counting the television. And these are tablets and their laptops and their phones, and there's different apps within all of them, and some of them are synced up and otherwise are not. Some of them are not, and so there's just this flow that goes through all of these different screen-based devices and all the apps and platforms inside of them. And sometimes I just want to speak for myself, I get lost in there. I really genuinely do, and I think all of us have had that experience of 2 minutes into doing something online, not having a clue why we even went in there to begin with. And I find that happening to me quite frequently. And so for me, I think it's that lack of friction. And on a practical level, it's something that I try to kind of figure out how to sort of create those stop signs that don't naturally exist there.
Yeah, I mean, building off of what Tia said, I feel very similarly that the reminder that we are in an attention economy and that these devices grew out of consumerism and that they are designed with the hook model to keep us actively engaged, and that the commodity we are trading, like Alu said, is our time and our attention and our life force into these devices. And so like Tia was saying, that lack of friction for me, I think that's mostly what I notice is useful about this book and my work, is that you can place physical stops in the way of like getting sucked in. So that can be just knowing that like your phone doesn't need to be next to your bed at night. It could be charging in the kitchen or in the living room, somewhere where you're going to take more time to just be with yourself in the morning before you look at it or before you go to bed. That you can install apps, like there's a minimal app that allows like you to just have 3 things on your screen. So you don't have a full screen of items to tap into. And so for me, I really do feel like knowing that this history is evolving so quickly, that this technology is moving really quickly, and that being tapped into how and why it evolved, and that it isn't necessarily for our good, it is to capture our attention, is really pivotal to taking back the control and like converting it back into a tool.
Awesome. I actually have a chapter dedicated to that in the book. It's called the environment. I think the environment is super important because it either aids or affects whatever it is that we are trying to build. There's a research that shows that just the mere presence of your phone affects the quality of interaction and communication that you're building. So you're not even using the phone, it's just dropped, just the mere presence of it. And one of the things that we know in our dispensation is the concept of phobing, which is the idea of getting distracted with a device while in interaction with other people. And so the perspective is this: if just the mere presence of a phone reduces the quality of engagement, how much more when we are distracted by using the various technologies that we use while in interactions with these people. And so one of the principles that we share also in the book is the concept of scheduling and time boxing. The idea that if you can set a specific time for a specific activity, it becomes very easier to navigate the different activities that you have to do across the day. I'm checking the chat box if there is any question while we are trying to wrap up this segment, so we move to the next. If there's any question, we will briefly come back to it. But I wanted to take the final thoughts from our amazing panelists, and I'd like to start with you, Chris. Your final thoughts in the perspective of we're in the year 2023, the third month of the year is just starting. What are the things that we can essentially do to live digitally well in this year? But it doesn't essentially have to be based on the question I just asked. Now, essentially, just your thoughts generally.
Yeah, I always, whenever it's that one thing, what's the one thing we can do? I always say awareness. It's the first thing when it comes to behavior change. But I think definitely this is reflected in the conversation today and the conversation within your book. It's awareness through a positive lens, because quite often on this subject, Tracy touched on the fact that, when we look at tech ethics, sometimes it can be a bit controversial to say tech is neutral in that space, because there's a lot of kind of negative press about tech, and that happens for good reason, and that it gets awareness in people's eyeballs. But when we're actually looking to help people change, we need to do it a little bit more gently. People don't change by learning kind of all the negatives. They learn by seeing reward and positive change in their life. So I think it's having awareness and using something like your book to actually
when you open the door,
learn through that, but then doing it through the lens of positive psychology and looking at everything as far as what's the positive impact this is going to have in my relationship with my friends, my relationship with myself, my ability to work better, and my ability to be a more healthy human.
Yeah, before I let you go, I would also like you to talk just very briefly on Unplug and where people can find more information if they want to after today's conversation. Did you get that?
Was that for me?
Okay, I wanted you to talk briefly on your platform and where people can find more information about that.
Who's that for?
Your platform, Unplug.
Oh, sorry. So we don't have a platform. We're a behavior change consultancy. But thank you for the opportunity. So we're a services organization. So when it comes to platforms, we'd work with the likes of the Digital Wellness Institute because they have an amazing e-learning platform. But we provide services. So we work with some of the biggest organizations in the world, like the UN and Microsoft, and we deliver in workshops, consultancy, coaching into their leadership teams. But we're at unplughq.com.
Okay, so that's where to go, unplughq.com. Let me go over to Theodora.
Sure, thanks, Olu. Yeah, it's always difficult to answer that question of just the one thing. I think what I go back to is something that I had shared with you after I first read the book, as being one of my maybe sort of favorite quotes from the book, which was, to trust and be trusted is an important virtue of the digital space. I think that idea of trust is incredibly important, and it's a conversation that I've had with people who are, educators and therapists and just individuals who are struggling with balancing their own tech use. It's a really frequent conversation sort of within families and parents. A lot of people seem to be finding that to be the case, that our ability to trust ourselves and each other is actually really deteriorating. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we're increasingly communicating with each other essentially indirectly, right? We have this sort of middle person or this middle sort of device that does the communicating for us. And it's very difficult to get a sense of the other person when you're doing that. So I think our use of technology is really impacting that in a very big way. And it's something we need to think about a lot. So For me, the key word is trust. I would say that's sort of a year-long exercise, maybe a lifelong exercise that people can engage in, at least this year in 2023, to think a little bit about where they stand when it comes to that and how they feel about their trust in other people and themselves, and how much their technology use really impacts that. One of the concrete examples that I often use for that in some of the coaching work that I've done with individuals over the past couple of years, I've often found that people who tend to use a lot of wearable devices tend to rely on them to tell them how they're feeling, as opposed to being able to tell me themselves how they slept, how they ate, how they feel this morning, are they well rested? And it was a really interesting experience. Anytime I would ask a question like that, the person would go to the device and go, well, hang on, let me just pull up the report and then I'll be able to tell you. And that's one of the things that was incredibly jarring to me, having those conversations, because I thought, you should be able to tell me how you slept last night or how you feel this morning. And in fact, I want you to be able to do that. It's a really important thing to be able to do. It's a sort of one of our basic bodily functions, if you will. If you extrapolate that into much more complex things, you see how much our technology use can potentially impact that. So in the context of families as well, if we have any parents watching, I would also say that in order to build that trust, there are a couple of things that are really important. One is that you start talking to your children very, very early on about your technology use, about their technology use as well, and that you keep that conversation ongoing. And it's never too early to start. As soon as your child starts interacting with whatever form of technology, that's the time to slowly start bringing up these ideas about self-control, self-management when it comes to the technology use, about being really selective, about the virtual spaces that we interact with, what are the types of content we consume, and so on. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, of course, as you want to engage in keeping your child safer online, using things like parental controls and some of these other sort of tools that can be a bit controversial sometimes, in order to really maintain that trust with your child, you need to do that in a very open and transparent way, and you need to bring them on board with that from very, very early on, and make sure that that's really a collaborative process with your child. So in a word, I think it would be trust, trusting ourselves and each other. That's something that I would really encourage really everybody to sort of direct their attention towards in 2023.
Yeah, and before I let you go, so I know you do a lot with parents and family, and you just spoke a bit to that towards the end. So if someone wants to learn more, especially within the context of digital wellness, as we navigate the schools, as we navigate our children, as we navigate families and parents, where can they find more information about you on that?
Yeah, so I would direct everyone to my website, which is TOP Coaching. So that's TEOP coaching.com. And you'll be able to find a lot of the articles I've written. There's a lot of free resources I share there. And then, of course, if you want to know a little bit more about what I do, then feel free to just contact me through the website.
Awesome. Tracy, we go over to you. And as you share your final thoughts, there was a question that I think fits best into the work that you do. And the question says, just checking for it. Okay, how do I balance my screen time if the bulk of the work that I do is online?
Definitely. Yeah, this is I'm really glad that Tio sort of started talking about the quantified self and how people with these wearable devices and the capacity to look in and only look at the data instead of learn how to ground and feel into themselves. There's that big shift towards that. And I'd say the easiest way to balance your screen time, if you're doing the bulk of your work online, one is to make sure that you are in front of natural light, that you have access to some sort of natural light and a window, because that keys our brain into engaging away from the screen. I feel that that's always been really helpful. And then two is to use those tools of that data to notice how you feel when you read it. And so when people read, oh, I spent 8 hours scrolling TikTok, there's a feeling that comes with that. And so if you're doing the bulk of your work online, I think it's really important to set spaces where you can close your computer, leave your phone, and really say, okay, now we're going to time box, which you discussed, Alu, doing like cooking without the phone or without some sort of like tech technical device playing information, and we're just going to focus on what it feels like to cook, or we're going to go on a walk and not take our phone and not listen to something. And so I think that if the bulk of your work is online, it's learning how to have activities or hobbies that aren't screen based or screen focused. So if you're spending a bunch of time online, don't then go like sit down and watch TV for 2 hours to unwind. Look into activities where the devices aren't there. I want to be really aware of our time. I know that we're going to close up soon. So yeah, Olu, if you want to, I put the link in the chat to the Amazon link so that you can buy the book. And I'll also place a link to some of my work if you're curious about it. It's going to be at Nested Feng Shui. There's a link there to all the digital feng shui, digital wellness work that I do, and a little bit more about me. And you can contact me through there. I'll also place my email in if you're curious. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, once again for taking our time to join this conversation. I think, like one of our speakers said, living digitally well is no longer an option; it's a necessity in our current dispensation. And I hope that from the conversations that we've been able to have today, we've been able to see the need and the importance of having a digitally well life. And I hope that, as I know some people are already getting the books, and some people plan to get it after today's conversation, that you find it impactful and you find it as a tool that helps you navigate this journey. We're all in the learning process, and I hope that with the resources that has been shared today, with the links of our speakers, as you go to learn more about the works that they do, and with the resources that you will find in the book, I hope that we will be able to build a solid digital life. Before we conclude, there's just one more activity that we'll be doing that Tracy will be anchoring. But before we do that, I was wondering if we were comfortable. I would like us to take a picture. So if your screen is off and you feel comfortable enough to put it on, please do that now. So we'll just take a screenshot. We'll just take a picture of everybody celebrating the launch of Digitally Well today. No pressure if you do not feel comfortable putting on your camera. So just do that briefly. Okay, kindly remove the spotlight. Awesome. We're good. Over to you, Tracy.
Beautiful. So to close out, guys, the same way that we started, we're just going to move from the top of our head, grounding back down into our feet, and then you can close out this space. So we're going to take a big inhale. You can close your eyes or keep them open, whatever you're more comfortable with, but inhale. I want you to think of your spine. There's like a golden light, and we're going to feel that golden light drop down our head, relax our shoulders. Feel that open chest space, let all that knowledge integrate, and whatever you need to remember as we walk away from this digital room and this space, know that you will remember and it will stay with you. And then dropping into your belly, just notice the energy there, let it settle, moving into our knees, our legs, and our feet as we drop into the ground. Just a big thank you to everyone for sharing this space, for coming together and really engaging with this idea of being digitally well. And I hope you all enjoy reading the book. And thank you so much to Olu for making it available and holding this space for all of us. Beautiful. Thank you, guys. Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the
rest of the
morning or afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone your feet is right now. Thank you, everybody, for taking our time.
Beautiful.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.